So welcome back, everybody. Hope everybody had a chance to stretch their legs, move out. Sure. So as Kevin just said, my name is Kathy Burke, and as Vice Chair of Community Futures, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Brian Smith. Brian is a social entrepreneur, innovator, and organizer. His career has taken him from co-op movement to working with people with disabilities to 10 years in economic development in the downtown east side of Vancouver. Brian teaches in the Community Economic Development Program at SFU, is the owner of Persephone Brewing Company, and is the Executive Director of Community Futures on the Sunshine Coast. His more recent venture is helping to guide the startup of RISA Capital. He will be talking about the partnership that formed RISA, the mandate it has for local impact investment, and the aspiration it has to spread to other rural parts of British Columbia. Brian's presentation today is entitled Social Finance, Impact Investing, and Social Entrepreneurship. Please join me to welcome Brian Smith.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brian. I'm glad Mark went first. I'm just going to put this over here, otherwise I'm going to toss it across the room. I'm glad Mark went first because Mark clearly thinks and then learns. I am the kind of person who does and then makes mistakes and then learns from those mistakes. So I just put that out to I guess situate that this presentation is based on my experience in this field and trying to address a bunch of these challenges. But I haven't researched them deeply like Mark has, or have a thorough sort of intellectual framework towards them, around them. But I'm hoping you can gain something from my experiences and what I think has worked and what hasn't worked. There's essentially sort of I'm going to try and do this in 3 parts. First part is I'm going to share with you what I've adopted as a theory of change, and in particular with respect to that social change that I think is necessary. The second part is what the mechanics are of social change in my world and in the way that I've adopted to address that social change. And then third, what impact investing looks like and how we can invest in that social change. So I was going to start with a couple of questions, but Mark stole my thunder from those questions. So I will just come back to the question that he asked us about what is poverty, and offer for you. My answer to that was that I believe poverty is a function of the systems that we've built, and I believe that there are mechanisms for us to change those systems. And in doing so, we can work to reduce and alleviate poverty, maybe even eradicate it. And I'll remain sort of hopeful in that cause. Can I just ask, who here has some familiarity with social enterprise? Oh wow, awesome. And how about impact investing? Okay, some. Okay, great. Great. So just before I carry on here, I want you to take a moment and think of somebody in your mind who is a leader in your community, who has what we might generally characterize as entrepreneurial characteristics. So they might be a business leader, they may be a leader in the public sector, they may be a leader in the nonprofit sector, but who has entrepreneurial characteristics such as willing to take some risk, creative in the face of adversity, resilient, and those kinds of characteristics. And just have that person in your mind for, while we go through this, and we'll get a chance to sort of touch in with who that is and what they're working on in a moment. Okay, so these are the 3 seconds. Oh, I should also say, I don't mind being interrupted as we go through this. In fact, I'd appreciate it, because often I feel like the feedback that I get from you and the questions that you want to talk about will guide our conversation and make sort of my presentation a little more relevant. So feel free to interrupt me or yell at me at any chance you get. I don't mind at all. Okay. Act 1, and there is no there's no theatrics to this, so it's okay. Okay, so theory of change. So I think partly, just to say, I think everybody should have a theory of change, how they see the world changing, and how they can intervene or interact with that theory of change to make a difference and do something positive. Here's one, and truthfully, this is very simplified, but because I don't typically present in and around poverty per se, but I wanted to give you a sense of some of my assumptions, some of my biases, some of where I'm coming from with respect to poverty. As Mark clearly pointed out, poverty is a problem for us all. So that's the problem issue, if you will. A couple of assumptions. One is that I think it's a function and a result of what we've built. So on one hand, underlying that means we ought to take responsibility for it, and it means that we can change it. And that we care. This is an assumption that I have about everybody in this room. In fact, everybody in my community cares about justice and equity. Influential factors. So there's a bunch of influential factors around poverty. Mark talked to some of them, and I appreciated his term, vulnerability factors, which I started to kind of delve a little deeper into what some of those factors are. I kind of, just offered a couple general, culture, policy, education, but obviously Mark's was a little more comprehensive and meaningful. And then to get to where I want to spend most of the time is what are the desired outcomes? Like what do we want to improve in order to address poverty? So this is me sort of jumping past the thinking and into the doing a little bit. I think at the sort of top of the list for me is generally the language around access to capital. And I don't just mean, and also sort of referencing Mark's comments, I don't mean money, because I think of money as just getting spent, as a connotation around spending. But I mean capital, because capital we typically have a connotation around investing. So that's where my work is right now, is really in and around investing in the future and investing in models to change. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the sort of top two, the notion of social capital and financial capital as particularly key in addressing poverty. Not to say that the other types of capital, like natural capital, cultural capital, spiritual capital, aren't critical. In many ways, I think, and in fact, in a past life, did some work with an organization in partnership with Tamarack around belonging, and a sense of belonging as being critical to address people's well-being and having a good lifestyle, life. And so I don't want to take away from those other forms of capital, but for the sake of this 1 hour that I have, I'm going to sort of try and drill down into social and financial capital as key. And then this is just a sort of a general statement that I think we can all sort of resonate with, the desired outcome. So the strategies that I work in is social enterprise, social innovation, working with social entrepreneurs in particular, and social finance. And I'll get into definitions of what that is. So this being my, if you will, theory of change of how we're going to address poverty among other societal ills, it sort of captures where I'm coming from. And for me, so did this picture, and I actually just saw this Facebook, the one who's a Facebook. Because we'd seen the first two images for years, that meme's been going around, the difference between equality and equity. But what I appreciated was a friend and colleague from Quesnel posted this to her Facebook this morning, highlighting that third slide, which I think starts to get into a deeper, more complex and nuanced conversation about how we address things like poverty, in that we need to change the system, not the accommodations or services that are provided to people in order to sort of even things out. So I just great image. That really resonates for me. Okay, so the mechanics. I wasn't going to play a video, but I do want to play a video. And you'll have to bear with me. Hopefully sound will work. In many ways, it's sort of redundant, but I think hearing it from a different perspective will be valuable. So let's see if this works. I don't think I need to introduce this because Mark made, yeah. out.
you, Kevin.
No, I think this is,
Can you check the on button on the switcher?
yeah, there's no lights.
Actually, it looks like it is blind.
All right.
No big deal. We can do it. Now we got images and no sound, but okay. So the story. I wonder if I can narrate it. The short sort of synopsis of this. The gentleman who we saw at the front end, his name is Dr. Muhammad Yunus. He's a Nobel laureate, worked in Bangladesh, his home country, and developed something called the Grameen Bank. Anybody familiar with the Grameen Bank story? Good. So some awareness around sort of microfinance. He's a social entrepreneur, and what's great about this video is he's narrating it, and he talks about effectively the same thing that I think is resonant in Mark's message and my message. That is, that it's systems and policies that are fundamentally flawed and that lead to poverty. And that his approach to changing those systems, particularly financial institutions and banking systems, in his case, but also policies at local, state, and national levels, can address poverty. And he has an aspiration to eradicate poverty as well. So there's me doing a poor job of what he was about to say. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit, some definitions. Let me check my notes here. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so I wanted to sort of emphasize at this point. So we know if we can agree for the sake of this afternoon that systems are at fault, let's change the systems. And I believe one way to address the systems is to ID the system elements and the policies within them that have installed barriers. And this is the other sort of corollary language for me is how do we create access to capital? So coming back to that asset, and in particular the financial and social capital. I believe that social enterprises and social innovations are particularly apropos and deliberately constructed to address access to capital. In a way that few other organizational models or initiatives are. The one example, I'll leave that for later. Okay, so the definition of social innovation. So in Muhammad Yunus's circumstance, he used the social innovation that was relatively new at that time, called microfinance. So in simple terms, it is essentially lending very small amounts of money to very poor people to buy, for example, a goat, which then produces milk and improves nutrition as well as produces a product, and then they could sell and they start to. So essentially, they have access. The financial institution, microfinance, provides financial inclusion. So that's that example in Bangladesh in a very rural setting. Here's a more general sort of definition, if you will, that I thought was quite good. Social innovation is a novel solution to a social problem that is more effective, efficient, sustainable, or just than existing solutions, for which the value created accrues primarily to society as a whole, rather than private individuals. Okay, social enterprise. In Muhammad Yunus's example, the Grameen Bank is the social enterprise. So it's the vehicle, if you will, that he uses to implement microfinance, to implement the social innovation, which is microfinance. And so it's often referred to as the bank for the poor. And there's a bunch of definitions. Oh shoot, there's usually highlighting around this. So really, so there's a whole bunch of different definitions of social enterprise, and I really don't want I don't want anybody to get hung up on one definition versus another. I find it more inhibiting than liberating to sort of hang your hat on a particular definition. So I sometimes use the word social enterprise, I sometimes use the term social venture. Let's assume those are basically synonymous for the sake of our conversation. But I like in particular the first paragraph, or the first sentence is usually highlighted. A social enterprise is an organization or venture that achieves its primary social or environmental mission using business methods. Okay, so it's kind of simple in that way. Complicated and then this is an even more simple sort of visual to capture what I think is a social enterprise. So most for-profit businesses, at least up until sort of recently, where social enterprise became and corporate social responsibility has gained ground, most businesses are focused on a financial return on investment. What's the profit, bottom line, and the profit margin? The nonprofit sector and charitable sector in particular is focused on social return on investment. And so for me, social enterprise is a discussion around blended value, where business models can achieve both financial returns and social returns. So business models that address profitability and housing, or financial return on it for investors' shareholder dollars, and literacy, or addressing poverty or whatever the issue of the day may be. So this for me is the simplest version of what a social enterprise is. There is a whole spectrum of the different kinds of returns, and I won't spend too much time getting into each of these details, nor the next slide where there's a bunch of different legal models. But rest assured, there's options within that field. Some are businesses just giving back a little bit. And so that's fine. Corporate social responsibility has its benefits. And others are very sort of non-profit focused, program focused, and having a big social return, but really aren't financially viable for equity investment or private investment. So there's a spectrum to find. And I also wanted to highlight as a great resource the Social Innovation Generation. This was borrowed from a slide from Tim Broadhead, who really is one of the fathers of social enterprise and impact investing in Canada, and worth looking this up if you want to get into more detail and learn from them. And then I mentioned the legal model. So there are a bunch of different legal models. And again, we could talk ad nauseum really about the different structures that one might be what might be appropriate in some cases or other cases, and it all depends on what your circumstances are, what your issue is, and how you want to tackle what kind of assets you have, what kind of partners you have, all those different sort of nuances. But I wanted to share this to say, if anyone is interested in applying a social enterprise or social venture approach to affecting social change and affecting positive change in the community, there is a legal model to do it. Okay, social finance, real quickly. And there's a slight difference between social finance and impact investing. In that social finance is more generally sort of more general term. An approach to managing money which delivers a social dividend and an economic return. Social finance is often used to describe lending and investment into companies that consider themselves social enterprises, charities, cooperatives, and other impact-focused organizations. So social finance really is focused on that social return being derived from business activities. And then, I would push the impact investing space a little further to the left on that spectrum that I showed you earlier, a little bit more focused on financial return, or at least ensuring financial return of capital of investors, if not like profit to investors, but not losing the fact that there needs to generate social and environmental impact out of that investment activity. So, if you will, again, there's a spectrum on which that social finance and impact investing lives. And I wanted to mention this one just really quickly. 308. What am I aiming for? 348, right? Is mine 345? So, okay, so traditionally, this is how we've addressed problems. And in particular, nonprofits have addressed problems in their communities. Traditionally, we've identified what a problem is. We've come up with a solution about how to solve it. We went and then try and find funding, whether it's grants from government or from the philanthropic sector. And then we applied a business model, which most times is it has to be a charity or at least a nonprofit. And then you go. The new model that I think and that we're starting to work in now might be that you address you find the idea problem, find a solution, and then look at a bunch of different business models that would be most appropriate to address and apply and implement that solution, and then ask yourself, okay, how are we going to finance that business model? The big thing that I want to sort of just point out is in this case, the limited sources of capital, economic and financial capital, and the limited business models versus lots of possibility and lots more options to implement your approach. Okay, and then social entrepreneur, being in many ways, I think, at the center of this Venn diagram. I am finding more and more how critical it is to work with an entrepreneur or a group of entrepreneurs who have that social sort of bottom line mentality or multiple bottom line mentality. So in this case, it was Mohammed Yunus and now. I just want to take a step back here and now offer, it might seem a little bit late in my story here, but offer a little bit of my background. And I offer it to also identify, my biases, but also the perspective and where I've learned about social entrepreneurs. When I was young, we're going to come around to this, so if you don't like listening to me, you can feel free to read ahead, because I'm going to get you to talk a little bit about what you think of this. But when I was young, I was angry, and I now call myself a recovering economist, because that's when my undergraduate degree was in economics, and it didn't satisfy me for a bunch of the what I think now are obvious reasons, and primarily that the storyline of neoclassical economics is the rising tide will float all boats, and it just doesn't work. We know this. So started getting into community economic development, and went to work for the BC Co-op Association. Two big learnings for me out of the Co-op Association experience. One is that I still believe co-ops to be the most democratic organizational model to democratize both power and wealth. So I still believe in the co-op model, and yet the other big learning was they're exceedingly difficult to set up and maintain and sustain. So there's a time and place for co-ops. I think credit unions in particular have found their place, and other sort of more established models of co-ops have found their place. And there's a whole new set of co-ops that are starting. Car co-ops, bike sharing co-ops, et cetera, that are actually exciting to see the co-op model being employed again because of a belief in justice, economic justice, and the democratization of power. Okay, so co-op movement finished with, and I went to work for a nonprofit organization called PLAN. Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network. I worked for PLAN for about 10 years on a bunch of different projects. I'm going to talk about PLAN in more detail in a bit. Two big learnings out of PLAN. One was that relationships are at the center of social change. Alec Mansky is one of the leaders, founders and leaders around PLAN, and really is one of the key leaders in the disability movement in Canada historically. Along with his partner, Vicky Kamak, he always talks about relationships as being key. So any of the work that we're going to do if it's going to have an impact, it's going to have to be rooted in relationships that we have. The second big learning was that everybody has a contribution to make. And so I learned in working with PLAN, who works closely with people with disabilities, especially developmental disabilities, was that everybody has a contribution to make. So that got, I think my wheels turning about what is the contribution and why are some people's contributions not remunerated or recognized or accommodated, and how much are we losing out on as a society by not accommodating those different kinds of contributions. So, and like I said, I'll get back to PLAN in a bit. So that's the two lineage for PLAN. Then I went to work in the downtown east side, and I worked for an economic development organization called BOB for a while. Then I worked for Atira, which is a housing organization. And I had a couple of big learnings from the downtown east side. Lots of learnings, but two key ones I wanted to highlight. One is that grants, like giving grants and the grant money cycle, doesn't have any longevity. It's that people have longevity, grants don't. And the second sort of big learning was that finance has a multiplier effect, where grants only have a summing or addition effect. So grants, if you have $500 grants, you got 500, then you got 1,000, then you got 1,500, and so on and so forth. Financing social change is 500 times 500. So you get upwards of 25,000, and so on and so forth. So that was a big learning for me, and I'll come back around to why now I work in social finance and impact investing. But that was the crux of it. Then I went to work, started having kids and whatnot, and then went to work. I did a short stint at Advanced City Credit Union, trying to figure out affordable housing finance. Then went to work for Community Futures. All of you, I think, have some familiarity with what Community Futures does. on the Sunshine Coast, it's, I think, maybe slightly different, or at least I'm only really, kind of very intimately aware of the Sunshine Coast one, where there's a lot of social entrepreneurs already interested in having a positive social return, as well as gaining a financial return on their business model. So a big learning over the last 5 years as executive director at Community Futures has been that entrepreneurs are who I want to work with. Figuring out who the social entrepreneurs are in my community, which is why I had you place that person in the back of your mind earlier, is fundamental to us affecting social change that will have long-lasting impact. And then in the meantime, I like beer, so I started a brewery called Persephone Brewing Company, and it is a social venture. It's in part owned by a charity that serves people with disabilities called SCACL, Sunshine Coast Association for Community Living. We hire a whole group of people with developmental disabilities. Persephone is based on a farm, so we're trying to connect the agricultural business model with the brewing business model and really build social change off the back of the craft beer industry. I can talk about Persephone in more depth, and I know some people are more interested in talking about beer than economic development. But I'm not going to talk about it very much in this presentation. I'm happy to afterwards. And then recently, about a year ago, we started Rise of Capital. And this is, again, I'll come back to, I think, critical that we start investing. Okay. Okay, that's a bit about me and where I'm coming from. Okay, so this is where I want you to just take 3 minutes. Yeah, we got 3 minutes. 2 minutes, somewhere in there. Turn to your neighbor. Name the person that you have in the back of your mind that you think is a leader and has entrepreneurial characteristics. And consider these characteristics and whether that person has these characteristics. Because I think my point in here, in sort of sharing these characteristics that Marilyn Struthers, really, I think at first flushed out, was that there's a archetypal version, our archetype version of what a leader is. And then there's new leaders in our communities. And I think there's a shift that's happening from archetypes like, dominant, powerful, wealthy, Caucasian, male, so there's a bunch of assumptions around what leader is. And now I think we see many different kinds of leaders emerging, partly because they have these kinds of characteristics. So just real quick, turn to your neighbor, name your person, and consider whether or not they have these characteristics, or whether they're the older archetype of version of leader. And go.
their society operates entirely childcare. I would probably say, probably to our society, for sure. It's a non-profit, but because of the business model, neutrality is really defined being able to balance your revenue and your costs with all the right things. It's running. No, but it's running into trouble. It's running into trouble because business model of running childcare it's not designed or they just invest back in. Yeah, and it should any other child care they're running deficits to make sure that they can invest in their staff, so that they can keep the space for many because child care and kids. It is licensed ultimately but it becomes a barrier. So you have to have certain people with certain backgrounds, with certain amount of kids, with integration, it takes very much money. But this side of the story, one to 2 years, child care space, and you walk through the door, maybe you have they're actually funding
Okay, I just wanted to ask if there would be a couple of volunteers, just really quickly, to put your hand up and share if your circumstance. So the person that you have in mind, you don't have to name them if you want to sort of retain privacy and whatnot, but the person that you have in mind and whether they're sort of fit into that sort of older version of a leader or whether they fit into this newer version or some hybrid. Is there somebody who'd like to share who you're thinking of? Please.
Well, my comment on that is I'm not naming an individual. I think there's a lot of people in Revelstoke that fit this description. And I would say even the folks in Revelstoke that are leaders that one might think fit that older model description that you talked about, I think they have a lot of these characteristics too. So I think we're blessed with a lot of people that could be this. The question then becomes awareness, motivation, and time, if you're asking to be change agents. So I don't think there's a shortage of this typology. I think there might be those other shortages.
Good to hear. There was another hand.
I changed my mind. The guy I'm thinking of was from Calgary, and after I heard you speak, I thought, you know what, let's keep it a smaller town.
Okay.
I think I'd like to hang it on my wall and strive to be that.
I'll take that. Okay, so wanted to, and I refer to a couple of different people and social entrepreneurs and their organizations within here. And I want to just, I guess my message is, there's a lot of social enterprise happening now. There's a lot of social entrepreneurs and social innovations that are hitting the ground. These are just a group, some that I've had the pleasure and honor to work with. But there are literally thousands. And if you start, sort of digging into organizations like Echoing Green and Ashoka and School Foundation, they're working with thousands of entrepreneurs who are looking at changing the world through their application of a business model and business principles. Yes?
Is Save-On Meats the one on Hastings?
Yeah. So, Save-On Meats is now owned by a fellow by the name Mark Brand. I'll just share a quick story about that one, and then I want to give another story about plan. I mean, there's so many great examples, and what I also wanted to kind of, the message I wanted to include in here is the diversity of sectors and types of business models that can address issues. So Save On Meats is on, it was in fact 55 years old. Save On Meats, the owner, the original owner, Al Delorier, decided to retire. And I happened to be working in the downtown east side, and he came to the organization I worked at and said, I'm ready to retire. My employees don't want to buy out the business or take over the business. And yet, Save On Meats at that time was really one of the very few sources of protein for people who lived in the downtown east side. Because what Save On Meats would do, which was really a social enterprise before it was anybody called him that, but he would sell somebody like a hamburger or a hot dog, and he'd cook it for them so that they could eat it. Because many SRO, single room occupancy hotels in the downtown east side don't have any cooking facilities. Even hot plates, for the most part, aren't allowed in SRO rooms anymore. So they couldn't cook their protein, so they ate very little protein. So what this fellow Al was doing was really, finding a social bottom line, in that case, a health bottom line, in his business model. When he was retiring, a fellow, Mark Brand, stepped up and said, we can't lose Save On Meats from this community. So he bought it, in part due with financing from the organization I worked at, which was Bob. We loaned him the first, what I would call patient capital, $100,000, and then he renovated it, and now has been all through the medias and public opinion and renovations, and really challenging, I think it's around 6 years now, challenge to figure out what kind of business model actually works financially and meets a social return on investment. So some of you will be familiar with his story, and I think he's doing a great job of trying to figure out. He has a staff, I think, around 200 people. 60 or 65% are people from who are in the downtown east side who would otherwise not have jobs. He has on staff sort of social worker and employment support people. He's helped his employees find housing, make sure they're healthy. A whole bunch of other things are built in and underneath, and comprise the foundation of what Save On Meats is as a social venture, not just a place where you can get a burger. So that's one example I wanted to share. Atira was the other example I wanted to share. So Atira, the mothership, is a nonprofit charity serving women and children coming out of violence. It's around 25 years old now, probably. Grew to a big organization providing mostly housing services to women and children coming out of violence, not just in the downtown east side, but across the lower mainland. And then I think it was about 6 years into Atira, they had several thousand units of housing, and were paying property managers to keep it up, do the tenancy, make sure there was turnover, and rental agreements and all that kind of stuff. And they decided, why don't we just pay ourselves to do the property management services? So they founded a wholly owned subsidiary company, which is, so Atira Women's Resource Society is the charity. It owns Atira Property Management Company, Inc. Atira Property Management Company is where I worked as the chief operating officer, and they now have, I think, something of about 6,000 units of housing across the lower mainland, primarily focused on women and children. And so now you have a for-profit entity, if you will, serving and providing the property management services to the nonprofit. So any profits made out of this property management goes back to the mothership. You also have an alignment, and in many ways the alignment of these two is where the greatest social return on investment was. One example of that was that when Atira, now about 8 years ago, got a portfolio of provincially owned SRO hotels, single room occupancy hotels, and the portfolio was, at that time, I think it was 16 hotels. So they were going to have to do a hiring of about 180 people needed to be hired in about a week to work in those hotels. So what Atira did, and really I think a large bit of credit goes to Janice Abbott, who's the CEO, and really sort of genius behind Atira and hardest worker, said, why don't we hire people from those hotels? So they went and put up the hiring stand in each of those hotels and said, if you live here, you're eligible to work here. And so they did, and I think it was around 85% of the people hired, of those 180 people, were from those hotels. And what we found was a couple of big, now seem like obvious pieces, but at the time were, I think, profound. One is people who take care of the homes do a better job of taking care of their homes than just renters. So the hotels started to be more well kept, less violence, healthier people moving out of hotels and into other rental accommodations, so growth, personal growth. And what that is coming back to that learning I mentioned at Plan, which was everybody has a contribution to make. When people started to contribute to their own community, to their own housing situation, to their neighbors' lives getting better, they gained a sense of meaning, a sense of belonging, and that led to an upward cycle instead of a downward cycle of poverty. The other thing that we found was the retention was high. So people who got jobs in the downtown east side in these hotels stayed longer than that other 15% who we hired from outside the community. The other 15% went, holy shit, this community's really messed up. I don't know how to deal. It's too stressful. It's like, and so there was lots of turnover of people coming into the community thinking, oh, I could be a hotel manager, or I'm a social worker, I can handle this. The people who we hired from the community were much more resilient, prepared, and committed, and dedicated to affecting change in their community. So that's a bit about Atira. And then the other story, example I wanted to share is Plan. So, Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network. The crux and most sort of central and important piece of work that Plan does is that it works with a person who is vulnerable to being isolated to make a good life for that person and a good life for that person's family. So it was a relatively new phenomenon when Plan started, which was that people with developmental disabilities were beginning to outlive their parents. That only started about 25 years ago. Up until then, people were dying prior to their parents. Well, parents were now getting to an age of going, who's going to look after my son or daughter or nephew or niece or brother or sister who has this developmental disability, these circumstances and characteristics that make them really vulnerable. Vulnerable to poor health, to poverty, but maybe primarily to isolation. And so that became a central goal of Plan, was to make sure that people with disabilities would have a good life. And the way that Plan does that, the mechanism they use, is essentially social networks. They started talking about social networking before Facebook. I say that on almost all my presentations. They started talking about how important social networks were in our lives before Facebook and LinkedIn and all these online social networks. And when you think hard about it, we all have healthy social networks. We're fortunate to have access to healthy social relationships and social networks. But people who are unique, who have characteristics that make them difficult to communicate with or make them unusual, don't necessarily have access to healthy social networks. People with mental illnesses, people with disabilities, people who have language barriers, a bunch of those vulnerability factors that Mark talked about make them vulnerable to being isolated. And isolation leads to a bunch of things, including poverty and poor health and all that. So what Plan does, and I work with Plan as a facilitator, essentially they hire community connectors to work with an individual. My fellow's name was Lyle, for the sake of this conference. Lyle and I worked together to build a social network around Lyle that was built on his assets and his offerings, his contributions. We did that. He's on the autism spectrum, speaks about 6 languages. Really very, very extraordinarily intelligent fella, but socially awkward and difficult, and frankly difficult to really get into a meaningful relationship with because of his unique characteristics. And so we started trying to figure out, what are Lyle's assets, what are his contributions, and how do we build a network around that? One of the first things that came up was he speaks Greek really well, and he loves to practice his other languages. He doesn't care what he's talking about, but he just loves to learn vocabulary and get into a conversation, and that's part of how he connects. So he also had an uncle who left him 5 years of season tickets to Canucks games.
Asset.
That's an asset. For some people. Lyle could care less. In fact, the first 2 years of those season tickets, the seats were empty because Lyle doesn't care about hockey, doesn't get hockey, doesn't, does nothing for him. But what we started to do was we met a fella who was a big hockey fan. It was a relationship of mine through university schooling that I was in at the time, and spoke Greek. So Lyle and this fella started to go to hockey games. And for that fella, he got to go to a hockey game. For Lyle, he got to speak Greek. And so they developed a relationship, and it still sustained. So this is now, I worked for Plan about 12 years ago, and it's still going on. Now this guy's buying the hockey tickets and taking Lyle. And so what started to happen was a relationship based on reciprocal contributions is one that has meaning and has sustainability and longevity to it. So the Greek fella started to invite, we have monthly network meetings, started to invite his, I think it was a cousin or brother, to the meetings with Lyle and I. And he brought his wife. And I kid you not, 4 months later, I'm at a plan, network meeting / meal with Lyle's network, and everybody is speaking Greek. And I'm like, ironically excluded from the conversation. But in many ways, that's what Plan is about. Plan is about connecting people who are vulnerable to isolation to community through leveraging their offerings and their contributions.